this is Chris Schmidt from Lasso, and welcome to the Voxel Mesher plugin instructional video series. This is where we're going to be stepping through every single parameter inside of the tool and seeing all the crazy things that it is capable of doing and explaining like the processes behind it and the different techniques. Now, there's a completely different video, the quick start video, and that one's going to be focused around doing project-based things where we don't worry about every single button, but more about doing a particular technique or another. The Voxel Mesher itself can do some pretty crazy things. Here you can see I've got the text as voxels, but here's an entire city converted to these cubes. And you can see as I scrub through, we can do some pretty crazy effects on top of that, even right here in the viewport. So let's jump right on in and talk about some of the basics. Assuming you've already watched the install video, you should be able to find your Voxel Mesher here under extensions. But instead of clicking on that, what I would like to do is add it to my interface. So this is all dealing with the volume stuff. So it's actually this palette right here that I would like to add it to. So I'm going to right click and say unfold palette, pull this over, and now right click and say customize palettes. Scooting this over, I'll search for the word voxel. And there's our Voxel Mesher. So now I can drag it directly into the interface, and now it has been docked inside that palette. Now, right-click on any part of this and say Fold Palette, and now I can grab this button and add it above where the previous one was. I don't need the old one, so I'll double-click on that, close down the palette, close down the Command Manager, and now we've added our Voxel Mesher directly into the interface. I'd like to make that more permanent, so I will click Windows, Customization, and Save as Startup Layout. So now, whenever I open a new copy of Cinema, it is automatically going to make sure the Voxel Mesher is inside. That's a preference thing. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. It will always live here under extensions. As I said, this is a step-by-step of all the different parameters and the techniques that you have to do to make Voxel Mesher behave the way you want it to. So let's start out by grabbing this text object, copying it, opening a new file, pasting it in, and let's talk about the very, very basic workflow. Now, I'm assuming you're familiar with the basic workflow of the volume builder. So you start with a volume builder, you put your text inside of it, and then you make a volume mesher, and you put the builder inside the mesher, and it's going to turn it kind of into a blob of text. It's remeshed the entire thing. Zoom up, and you see we get these lovely blobs, and they can blob into each other and do all sorts of cool, crazy things. I use them all the time. I've got so many different tutorials that touch upon them one way or another. Now, the Voxel Mesher has the exact same workflow. We are actually piggybacking on the volume builder itself. So I'll yank out that volume builder, delete out the volume mesher, and then go back to the same palette, drop down, and now we can find our Voxel Mesher from there. And then grab the volume builder, drop inside the Voxel Mesher, and instead of getting that big blob, we are now getting individual voxels. It looks like a bunch of pixelated cubes making it up. So that's the super duper basic workflow. Now, much like the volume builder, there's a lot of important settings in the mesher, but there's also settings in the builder. The most important one to mention right away, let's click on this volume builder, is going to be essentially the resolution that we get, or the voxel size. So if I grab this voxel size and change it from 10 to 20, the individual voxels are larger, essentially meaning it looks more pixelated. The bigger the number, the more pixelated. The smaller we make it, the higher the resolution. So if I put that down to 5, half the original number, you see suddenly we get this really high resolution on there. And we change this to anything we like. And there's actually a really fun parameter to animate as well. So exact same workflow back and forth, but the volume mesher's resolution is entirely dependent on the volume builder. Let's put that back to default. Now, much like the regular volume mesher, we can feed in any geometry that we like. So I can make a sphere here, put that also in the volume builder, and these two things will get blobbed together. Those should essentially merge with each other. If we go into the volume builder, we can say something like, oh, the sphere is not a union with the original object. It's going to subtract from the original object. It could intersect the original object. Going back to default, we can use this radius and kind of blend between those two shapes. You get this lovely kind of blur between the two shapes, letting the blob even smoother into each other. So everything you do with a volume mesher, you can also have this propagate through the Voxel Mesher. Deleting that out, the next thing I'd like to mention, and I did not know you could do this. You can actually do this with the regular workflow, but now it works with Voxel Mesher as well. And that is you can make multiple volume builders. So I'm going to make another volume builder, and let's just put another sphere inside of there. And this time I'll say this volume builder is going to have a way larger set of voxels, drop that inside of the Voxel Mesher, and it's actually going to work from both meshes. It looks at both different resolutions and returns both of them. This also works with the volume mesher. I just never knew you could do that. So you can add as many of those in as you want. They're essentially completely separate pieces of geometry that don't interact, but we don't need to have a bunch of voxel meshes. We only have to have one. Let's delete out that extra volume builder. And let's talk a little bit about the very, very basic workflow, something that we added in that's pretty handy. So when you're first creating a piece of geometry and we want to turn this into a bunch of voxels, you might be inclined, or accidentally, I do this all the time, is accidentally create a mesher directly and then nothing happens. If I put this into a mesher, there's nothing there. Now, if you feed this into a voxel mesher directly by accident, we actually added in a button. We've detected that you didn't have a builder underneath of it. So now that it sees the text, it's like, oh, there is something here. Do you want to create a volume builder? If I click on that, it'll automatically interject one in between, and we do get our voxels. So just a handy little quick button there. And as soon as it has detected that there is a volume builder, then that button will disappear and not get in your way. Now, there are other types of objects that we can feed into volume builders. If I delete out the text object, of course, you can do any regular piece of geometry, but you can also feed directly in things like splines. Grab this helix, drop it inside the volume builder. Maybe we'll make this a little bit taller here. And inside the volume builder, you get all sorts of cool settings where we can grab the spline and get spline specific settings where I can increase the radius a bunch. And then we can remap it along the length of the spline and we can shrink that down. So this is all getting converted directly into these voxels. So yes, you can work with splines. You can feed in multiple splines. You can even add a spline and the cube, and those two things will get blobbed and merged into each other perfectly. Deleting out both of those, the next type of object that we can feed in is actually a field objects. And all of these are field objects. To me, clearly the most interesting one is going to be a random field. So we can drag the random field directly into the volume builder and we're instantly going to see something. Now, in order for that to look a little bit better, I might say, give me a Luca type noise and start increasing my scale. And as I get large enough, you're going to start seeing that coherent mathematical noise represented in voxels, which is very fun. And if you're not familiar with this workflow, you can also change this shape. I mean, we could change these dimensions directly. If you click on the volume builder, click on the random field, you see we have this creation space of a box, but I want to do a different shape somehow. So I'm going to say, well, give me a sphere, and I'll make the sphere relatively large. Drop that inside the volume builder. So now we get a giant volume of a sphere. Inside of here, I'm going to move the random noise above it and change the creation space from box to the objects below. And suddenly we get the intersection of those two things. Instead, I'm going to say I want to subtract or intersect with it. And it's kind of this only outer shell right now, which we'll talk about more in the future. But for now, I could change my volume type to fog. And now you can see we get this entire fog of Luca noise based on that spherical shape. So very, very powerful. And we can go into our random field here, change any parameters we like. We change our noise types, increase that larger, add some animation speed in if we like. So now if I hit play, we have an animated volume of Luca noise inside of a sphere. So very fun combinations. So yes, we can also feed in random fields and create different volumes from that. Next up is Pyro. If I make a sphere and right click on it, add in a simulation pyro emitter, rewind to 0, hit play, and we'll start generating some smoke and some fire. If I grab the pyro output, I don't have to use the volume builder. I'll delete that out. You actually drop this directly as a child of the Voxel Mesher. And that's because the Pyro is generating its own voxels, but we don't see anything yet. And that's because in the Pyro output under the Objects tab, you have to actually be outputting one of the properties. Most of these are only set to go on export or on render. But if I say I would like to output the temperature, then now suddenly you do see some voxels hiding inside there. Now it's kind of hidden behind this big cloud of smoke and fire. So the only way I know to hide it is, well, you can't hide it via these dots. So what you have to do is go inside your Pyro object, go to Pyro scene, twirl this down, go to the Pyro tab, scroll all the way to the bottom, and you'll find Draw Pyro. And I can turn that off, and now the Pyro is not drawn, and we actually see our voxels instead. And just so you know, we can click on Voxel Mesher. We'll get to the setting in a moment, but you can change your range threshold, and I can increase or decrease that. And we actually see more of the smoke and the fire being represented right there as part of our volume. If I hit play, you'll see that is getting animated up through our Voxel Mesher. So very, very fun. And the last thing, the last way to feed in a raw volume of some type is actually use a VDB. So I'm going to load one in. This is from EmberGen. I'll pop open this gasoline explosion. I'm going to say I would just like the density, and now that gets popped in. And much like Pyro, this is generating its own voxels. So I can just feed this directly into a voxel mesher, holding down Alt or Option. It'll get fed in, and the instant I do, you can see that, again, we are getting this volume of the density automatically represented as all these lovely individual cubes. So that is all the ways that we can feed something in to get Voxel Mesher to generate something for us. What I'd like to do now is talk about some of the individual basic settings inside of the Voxel Mesher. So let's go back to my basic models, copy this text, new file, paste it in, and let's start walking through. I will feed this into a Voxel Mesher, say create my volume builder, very handy button, hit ND so I can actually see our polygons, and let's start talking about some of these settings. And specifically, we'll talk about these first two, our geometry mode and our range threshold. We just talked a little bit about the range threshold, but if I were to grab this, an artistic way of thinking about it would be sort of inflating or deflating the object a little bit. So I could say, okay, range threshold, start increasing, and you see the whole thing will inflate up to a point. And now I can also go back to 50%. If we go down, we can deflate, but again, only to a point. If we go too far, it's going to start falling apart until there's essentially no geometry at all. So that's actually kind of an interesting limit. Like, what is causing the range threshold to stop at a particular point, and why does it disappear when we go in too far? Well, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But just like I mentioned, there's a very important setting inside of the volume builder of the actual voxel size. There are additional important settings if you twirl it down. Here you'll see 4 very important settings. The main 2 for us right now are the interior voxel range and the exterior voxel range, where essentially it's like how far in from the outer shell, from the actual surface of the geometry, are we trying to see how much volume there is inside? And I did not understand this for the longest time, and it made the volume builder very confusing to me, but it's even more important here in the context of the voxel mesher. So if I were to grab my interior and exterior range, and I'm going to increase both of them, let's say to 5, suddenly you see that's not hollow anymore, and the entire thing got filled in. If I click on my voxel mesher now, go back to the default, you see it looks like exactly the same at default. But now if I increase my voxel range, it can actually go way further. And if I start decreasing my voxel range, it'll go further down and down and down and down until essentially we've erased it out because literally there's no volume left, but not because anything was missing. And that's all thanks to going into the volume builder and changing our interior range and our exterior range. So keep that in mind. Very, very important. Now, moving into the voxel mesher directly, let's start talking about our geometry modes. And these are kind of the bread and butter of the voxel mesher itself. So right now we are dealing with the shell of the object. So let's go and zoom on in and actually move inside the object. And you're going to see that essentially this object is hollow, but you see that we've got this big volume on the inside. But we're viewing the outermost shell and the innermost shell. So I just explained that interior range. So we need to increase my interior range until we've moved as many steps inside of the volume as we need to actually make it hollow. So now we truly just have this outer shell, and I'm moving inside a hollow O, all made out of these individual shapes. Now we are in shell mode. I can click on that. Individual settings that we have here. One would be that we have the inner only setting, and this will make more sense after we talk about some of the other ones. But if I click inner only, it's actually going to step in exactly 1. It's actually the inside of the shape instead of the outermost layer. And then, just as a way of demonstrating a lot of this, there's also this rescale geometry setting, and I can say subtract the scale of the geometry, and you see all these individual polygons are going to shrink down. You see that we do have this lovely hollow object inside. If I were, let's go back to our interior range. If I drop the interior range back to its default of 2, you suddenly see that we get this interior shell also being represented. So it'll increase that back until that erases out. And yeah, now we get these shrunk down from the outside. And honestly, those are the basics of the shell. The one last thing to note is the shell is not welded together. These are not physically connected. And it just makes everything run faster because we didn't have to do those calculations. If ever I do want these to be welded together, I just throw this into a Cinema 4D Connect object, hold down Alt or Option as I create it, and set our Fawn mode to manual. And now you see it looks exactly the same, but these are all now welded together. Now that they're welded together, we could do strange things like maybe create a deformer and make a smoothing. Drop that inside the Connect and round them out. And suddenly our voxel mesher starts looking like a volume mesher where it's all clean and rounded out. And honestly, the geometry is going to look very similar. I imagine that the final geometry is being generated kind of like this by generating that outer shell of voxels and then smoothing it out. So kind of fun that we can make this transition, make them as rounded as we want, kind of transition this in and out as we go. So keep in mind, you need to make a connect object in order to actually weld all those points together. Deleting those out, let's go back in our Voxel Mesher and go to our next geometry mode, and that is going to be cube mode. Now, you'll see it doesn't look visually any different. It looks identical, but if we're in shell mode, and I shrink this down a little bit, we have these individual polygons. If we're in cube mode, you'll see these are individual cubes. Now, inside, you're going to see that we actually have cubes all the way through the model, and that, of course, is, again, thanks to our interior voxel range being far enough inside. If we had like a big old object, like a big sphere, you would need a lot of interior voxel range in order to step through all of them, or potentially you would be switching this to fog mode, so it's filling in the entire volume of the fog. But those two modes are pretty different from each other, and I'm not going to be talking about that quite yet. So these are now cubes. These are welded together cubes, so that all works automatically. And we can rescale our geometry. We can actually go positive, so these could become extra large if you wanted to. But let's go down further. You can go smaller, smaller, smaller. All these individual cubes. You get some pretty cool looks even just from this. So I definitely dig these cubes. If you were so inclined, we could put this back to default and make a deformer like a bevel deformer. Down here at the bottom, create that, drop it inside, and this should automatically be beveling every single one of these cubes. And you see, there we go. All of them have been beveled properly, and you get your final geometry. There's actually better ways of doing that, but we'll get to that later. Deleting that out, there are a couple of additional options inside of our cube mode. There is going to be hollow object. So you already saw that we could change the interior voxel range, but if I click hollow object, it's not going to look any different. Every single cube that's on the outside of the object is being returned, but all those ones on the inside, if I zoom in, you see we pass through a cube and then it's hollow inside. So it's perfectly returning only that outermost layer. In addition to that, we can turn on invert now that hollow object is on. And invert is only going to return the interior, essentially the perfect opposite of the original one. Now, the reason for being able to do this type of thing is maybe we're going to be running a simulation of a bunch of cubes falling. I want the outer shell to be one color and the entire interior volume to be a different one. So in this case, we could make a duplicate of our entire voxel mesher here. And I'll say that this upper one is not inverted. So that's now the outer shell. And just so we can see it, I'll shrink our outer shell down a little bit. And let's grab both of them, change the color. So I'll say display color, automatic, and we'll make this upper one kind of a bright pink. And we make the inner one, we'll leave it white. So now you can see that we have an interior and an exterior, and they never overlap with each other. So that might be good for simulations or just optimizing and keeping something hollow, or maybe you just want to shrink your object down a little bit, but pretty handy. And this is actually why I have this shell mode. If we go back to shell and you have inner only, I can turn that on. And now we have a solid shell pushed in one, but we get these cubes only on the outside. So another neat way of combining those types of things. So let's delete out this top one actually, and go back to the original here. So in cube mode, you now see we get the unique settings of hollow object and invert. Very handy. Let's move to our next geometry mode, and that is going to be polygon mode. This is returning essentially a cube on every single center point of each voxel. But if I click on our polygon mode, it is now returning a plane or a single polygon on every single one of those voxels. Let's activate under options our SSAO so we can see some shadow highlighting. Hit NA just so we can see just the geometry. And this is almost creating like slices across the entire object. Now, obviously, we have the slicer object from Rocket Lasso, and it's a very different type of tool, but this is creating a similar effect, a little bit pixelated maybe. Now, there's a couple of unique settings to our polygon mode, primarily these orientations. Right now, it is on Y+. I can invert the normal and click -Y, so they're facing downward. But more importantly, we have X and Y and Z, so we can change all these orientations and create some cool different setups and looks with that, including if we made 3 of these, and now we could have our X, our Y, and Z, so we kind of get this crazy honeycomb-esque pattern where they're all intersecting each other. So pretty cool things you can combine there. And then we've also got them limited in the same way where I could say this is a hollow object, and now you see it's going to make all these interior ones disappear, and we can also invert those so we see the interior. So anywhere those combinations made sense, we made sure to leave them. And our last mode is going to be our point mode. And what this is going to do is just create a point cloud for you. And this is primarily for the purposes of, I suppose you could render directly on those dots, but mainly that you can clone onto them. So we have exactly the points only as we want to return them. So I could say, give me a hollow object and don't invert. And now you see we get this outer shell of points perfectly for a voxel setup. And I'll be showing you a bunch of stuff with cloners a little bit later. It's its own dedicated video because it's so important, but it's very, very powerful. So those are our geometry modes. Let's go back to regular shell, go to cube, go to polygon. Very fun to play around with. We've only got a couple more settings to talk about in this basic video, but there's a bunch more videos, so make sure to check all of them out. Next up, we've got our rescale geometry. We've already played around with that a little bit. If I start scaling that down, those will shrink. But in addition to that, we've got a scale field. If I activate that, we will get this field list in a handy group that we can collapse up and down if we want to, because field lists are quite large and obtuse. And inside of there, we can feed in any field. So to start out with, I will make a linear field. It'll automatically create that, feed it in, and you can see we get this lovely fall off that we can scale them down based on whatever field that we're feeding in. And, we could do things like invert. We could grab this and spin it and rotate. We could feed in a completely different field. Let's feed in a random field and change that to, let's do Luca again. I just like Luca because it's pretty high contrast. Start increasing that up a bunch. And now you can see we get this pretty cool pattern on there. We could be returning any mode that we like. Go back to our Voxel Mesher and go to shell only. And then you see how those are scaling. I could even go into that field list and we can layer up any other fields that we like solids, or inside the modifier layers, we could add in this case, I'll do a quantize and I'll say only 2 layers or 1 layer. And now it's either on or it's off. So perfectly there or perfectly not. And all sorts of fun things you do with that. And we could even grab our random field. Let's add in some animation speed, hit play. And now that will be animating along, erasing things out, putting them back in again. And that works in any mode. It also works in conjunction with our, scroll up, our rescale geometry. I could push that down further if I were so inclined. And we could even do things like, I'll delete the quantize. We'd even do things like unclamp that and change the range of things. So I could click on my random field, go down into its remapping, and you see we're outputting currently from 0 to 100. But I will create a range map and say, okay, I'm going to range map from 0 to 100 to 0 to 200. And now it's going to scale some of them up even larger. Let's say 0 to 500. And now you see some of those are going to get larger. Some are getting smaller. So we can even do that unclamped and control the scale directly from there. Turning off the scale field, I'm going to only talk about 2 more properties because we've got entire dedicated videos to some of the material stuff. So next up is the dimensions. And these dimensions are telling you exactly how many voxels there are in X, Y, and Z. So if I were to lock this and grab my text object and start scaling, you're going to see as I scale, the dimensions are going up. I can go down, and alternatively, let's double click on our volume builder. I could change our voxel size and I can drag that up. And as I do, you see our dimensions have been modified to show exactly how many are going across. So essentially it's the bounding box as divided by our voxel size. These numbers are very handy in theory for doing things like going into Espresso and driving something with Espresso. Maybe there's something you want to be perfectly matching. This will give you that information. Or alternatively, you could be using the dimension information to go into Photoshop and you can make a material that would be perfectly 69 by 24 and it'll perfectly project onto your object because you know those dimensions. And finally, if we go to our last parameter we'll be talking about in this video, you go to advanced and we've got all of these selection tags. So I could do something like say, hey, return Y plus, and you'll see a parametric selection tag get created right here called plus Y. And if I were to make a material, let's double click and set this to be another, let's go kind of this bright green. Apply that to the object, it's applied everywhere. But if I say limits to this parametric selection, then now only the top is going to be colored green. So very easy to get particular facing directions and output your materials only to that specific part. So another handy little thing inside of there. Now, this was only the beginning, some of the very broad strokes of the tool, but there's huge important sections that we're going to be talking about. The next video is going to be all about using the Voxel Mesher in combination with the cloner, which is incredibly, incredibly powerful. We've got entire other settings like these alternating layers, which is great for stacking. We've got 2 different videos all about colorizing and texturing and converting materials directly to be the colors of the Voxel Mesher. Very important video. And I'll be going over the example files as well. And of course, there is the quick start video, which is going to be a whole bunch of different projects you can check out. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you very much for picking up Voxel Mesher and supporting Rocket Lasso. If you make anything cool, I would love to see it. Definitely tag us on any social media so I can check it out. But that's going to wrap up this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye, everybody.